This morning we're doing a workshop that we have been hoping to do for a while. And so I wanted to be in a position to introduce the workshop so that we can talk about like why we're doing it and why it's important to GLPA. I want to start just by saying that we're in a people business. People matter. And you know the old saying that if a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, did it make a sound? We know it does, right? But if there are no people, is there a planetarium? And I would argue yes. Or no. No, I would argue no. Where was I going with that? Right. No. If there were no people, there would be nobody there to build it. There would be nobody there to run it. And if we didn't have visitors, we wouldn't be running it for very long, right? So people are an important part of what we do. And so we're doing this workshop on inclusion and intrinsic bias. That's probably not actually the word I was looking for, but I'll find it in my notes. Implicit bias, thank you. Because people matter. And so the executive committee asked Shannon to look into whether or not we could do that at this conference. And as we were working to plan this workshop with Dr. Garcia, who we'll introduce in a minute, we started to realize, she started to ask us questions about our organization, and we started to say, well, actually, we don't know. And so Shannon graciously agreed to head up a team to create a climate and demographic survey. And many of you did participate in that, and I thank you for that. But I want to give you a little background on why we're doing this. For one thing, we wanted to raise awareness for other people's experiences and feelings related to our professional work and our workplace climate. We want to start the conversation and the professional development that will hopefully help us to grow to be more inclusive individually and as an organization. The survey measures our need for this growth in inclusionary practices and the need for learning about our implicit biases. And we want to create a climate in which we can increase diversity in the field. And I know many of you probably read, if not participated, in a discussion on Domel that was actually kind of centered around why diversity matters. And so I want to just kind of share some of the things that I read and that I feel are important reasons for us to be diverse as a field. For one thing, talents. You wouldn't fill a toolbox full of hammers, right? You need different tools for different jobs. And so individuals coming from diverse backgrounds, I'm sorry that I keep hitting that, but I'm realizing that my contact is in my right eye, and that's the contact that I use for reading, and I want it to be over here. So I'm sorry that that's probably distracting. And so a diverse group of people is going to bring a better set of tools to our planetarium environment. Innovation. We get fresh ideas from a wider range of backgrounds. Climate. Members are more likely to be happy in an environment where people can be accepted for who they are. Retention. Members are more likely to stay long-term in an inclusive environment. It's the same for us in our organization. It's the same in our staff back at our institutions. And growth. An organization that embraces diversity makes it more inviting for a wider range of people to participate. Now, the survey is important because it gives us a snapshot of the climate of our organization and the wider planetarium profession. Shannon is going to share a portion of the survey results. Shannon and Keith Davis and Danny LeBlanc were the ones that really headed up that survey and did the work. So Shannon, come on up and share some of those results with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I do not have contacts, though. Hopefully I won't hit it so much. I don't see it. There it is. All right. All right. So we're just going to do a summary of the results, and I'm going to take this out and walk. This is just a few of the key things that we found when we went through the data that came into from the survey. There's going to be a fuller, more comprehensive summary of the results from that we're going to try to figure out a way to post it somehow so people can have access to it, so other planetarium organizations can have access to it as well, so that we can hopefully have these conversations more often. Also, thanks to Keith and Danny for helping. Danny LeBlanc at the Museum of Science in Boston also got her evaluation team involved to look over the survey and help us write this. And Dr. Garsha also helped us out with this as well. So this is just a quick summary. I'm just going to really go through what the results are, not really try to analyze what it means. And I would really kind of encourage people to not look at this and immediately jump to conclusions of what this means, but just kind of take it in for now. But the first thing that I want to start off with were the demographics. We had 101 total respondents by the time I went through the data. I think we've actually had a few more since then. I haven't actually closed the survey, so we can actually update these results eventually. But this is the age breakdown of what is your current age, and it's pretty well distributed between age range of under 25, 25 to 39, 40 to 54, 55 to 69, and 70 and older. So that's our breakdown. We have pretty wide range of ages in our organization. About 59% were male, and about 39.6% were identified as female. We are primarily people who identify as heterosexual or straight. And about 13% identified as not heterosexual or straight. There are a lot of options in that. We're kind of grouping things together because if we break it down by everything that we asked in that survey, it becomes a bit identifying, so we didn't want to do that. So that's why some of these got grouped together this way. We're also 91% white in the people who answered. And so the other 9% or so were anyone who wasn't white. So again, we were kind of trying to not make this identifying for who answered in the survey at all. And generational status, 58% are people who have, their families have been in the U.S. for several generations. That they and their parents were born here in the United States. So a majority are people who had families here for a while. And then the religion, so that we left that as an open question on the survey. So we just kind of tried to group them together because it kind of made every answer separate, even though a lot of people are saying Christian and more or less, but they said it in a slightly different way. So that's why we just kind of grouped it that way, and it's kind of a rough estimate there. Professionally, this is the breakdown in terms of the degrees. So most people have a 4-year bachelor's or a master's degree in the field. And then we kind of break down from there. We put these lines here to make sure that you know that this green goes with that one and not that one. So, thank you. You're welcome. Where am I? Oh, and then also we did put this survey, by the way, on Dome L and Dome Dialogues. We emailed it out through the GLPA listserv as well. So 76% of the respondents are from GLPA. So a majority of them were, because we were trying to get GLPA respondents specifically for today, but we did have other people who are not members of GLPA either, because we did want to also make this more of a planetarium-wide field. So I just wanted to point that out. Also a pretty wide range, even distribution of how long people have been in the field, from fewer than 5 years to 25 or more years. And this is just sort of the breakdown of who answered in terms of their type of position in the field. That was you could select multiple answers, so that does not add up to 100% before someone asks. But this is, I think, getting into the meat of it. So do you feel that promoting diversity, inclusion, and equity is a responsibility of the planetarium community? And 78% of our respondents agreed. So we all, and another 14 said maybe, And then 8% said no. So a majority of the people in our field do feel like this is part of our job. So this is a part of the reason why we wanted to do this and have this conversation and get this going, is so that we can have conversations on how do we do this and how do we continue to do this within our field. Now this is getting into sort of the climate pieces, how people answered, how they feel about their role and how they feel about the field in general. And so this, again, we're not going through every single question we answer. We felt that would be a little bit of information overload this morning. But we wanted to bring out some key things. So one, I have considered leaving the planetarium field because I have felt isolated or unwelcome. Most people haven't, but we do have a significant number. This is about 10 people, 10% of the respondents have considered leaving our field because they haven't felt welcome. They have felt isolated. So this is another thing to consider, like how can we make sure that everyone who comes to GLPA or comes to our organization feels welcome and here. And also, yeah. Mm-hmm.
When I hear that question, I wonder, are we saying welcome by our community or welcome in our profession, in like maybe their workplace?
That is a good point. And so this data doesn't really break that down. So the question is it welcome within the field or within your workplace? And that doesn't necessarily come out. We did couch this as a planetarium field, and it was specifically rather than your workplace, but that could be something that also, so that is a good point to bring up. Also, I have to work harder than others to be taken seriously. So we looked at this broken down by sex, by female and male. We did not, by the way, do any look at this by race at all, because again, we didn't want anything to be identifying with the demographics we had. Same with anyone who is your sexual orientation or gender identity as well. We did not do that. But if you look here by male or female, you can see that males generally more strongly disagree than females, or females tend to fall in one of two camps a little bit more. The planetarium community has a strong commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is the full sample in red on the left. We looked at this by generation, basically, and so if you look at 39 and younger, there is a skew towards disagree. Whereas if you look at people who are 55 and older, there's a skew towards agree that we do. And so one thing to just point out here is that there is a question of what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean? How does one define that? There is probably a different definition for every person in this room, so keep that in mind. But there is a generational difference that we can see. We did look also between 40 and 54, but it looked very similar to the same full sample. It was sort of like right in the middle there, just to point that out. So we do see some generational differences as well when it comes into this, so this is one thing to consider. Definitions are different, so try to keep an open mind. Have you personally experienced discriminatory events within the planetarium community because of your race, sexual orientation, or gender identity and expression? For the most part, people haven't, but there are still several people who have. And so that's something to consider, again, about trying to make sure that everyone is welcome and feels welcome and included here. Similar with veteran status, marital status, and national origin. I will note that the respondents here on marital status, all women who did experience something. So only women ever said that they have experienced discrimination due to marital status. Political orientation and ability or disability. Again, majority of people have not, but we do have several people who have. Religion, height or weight, social class. So same thing for a lot of these. Most people have not, but several people have at some point. So, and have you personally experienced discriminatory events within the planetarium community because of your sex? Over half of women have had at least one, compared to a few men. So there's a huge difference that we do see here. And this is, I think, part of the reason why this has come up and why we wanted to do this. Also, have you personally experienced a discriminatory event within the planetarium community because of your age? We do see a difference here between the generations again. People who over 50%, slightly over 50% of people 39 and younger have had at least one experience where they have had a discriminatory event due to their age. But we also have very significant portions of people 40 to 50, 54 and 55 and older. So it is going both ways. This was something that I think came up when we were asking this question and writing this survey was, well, in which direction? Are we talking about discrimination? Are you discriminating because you're younger or older? And it goes both ways. And so we're seeing that come out in the data when we look at this as well. And now this is another question that we had on the survey related to audience demographics because, as Jeff said, we are in the people business. We are trying to educate folks. And so we do need to also consider who our audience is and are we representing those that we are trying to teach. So there's a lot to unpack here. So this was the breakdown according to race. So most people answered that more than 50% of their audience is white. And that does make sense based off of the demographics of the United States. But we also have a lot of people that did answer that they had more than 50% of their audience was African American, or more than 50% of their audience was Asian American, or Indigenous. Well, no, not Indigenous, but more than 25 to 50%, or Latino or Hispanic. And so these are also things to consider that we are working in districts that are very different from how we look as a planetarium field. And so that is something to consider. And how do we also make sure that we are including and making our spaces welcoming for the people that we are teaching in our planetarium. And then this is also socioeconomic status. So I'll just leave those up there. I think we're still trying to figure out how best to really present this data because it's not as intuitive as the other ones. But so this is just a summary of some of the things we wanted to bring up that were really big and we thought would be good to share today. There's a much larger summary in PowerPoint form with a lot more notes in it as well that we're figuring out how best to share that. We'll post that once we have figured that out so that people can use this if you need to. We want to double check some things and make sure that nothing is identifiable and that nobody can be picked out from this data in any way. So it is anonymous. So we're working on that, but I wanted to share that. So back to Jeff.
So please join me and help to show our appreciation for the work that Shannon and Keith have done. Very excellent work. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Garcia. She will be helping us to grow in these ways that we've identified that we would like to grow. She is a member of the Michigan State University Department of Sociology and has since 2009. She joined the Office for Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives in 2014. She conducts workshops for the MSU students, staff, and faculty here. And she's agreed to come and help us to grow and take these next steps in improving our climate and diversity and our interpersonal skills. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Garcia.
for your birthday. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. I've really enjoyed working with Shannon and Jeff over the summer and into fall semester. I have no actual formal training in astronomy or anything related to outer space, but I think most of us have a special place in our heart with all of those issues. So thank you for bringing that to the world, and thank you for letting me come in today. I think Shannon did a really good job of outlining just some basics to think about. Obviously, it's important to remember that the data we have is just the folks who participated, so that we don't know what's out there in terms of who didn't participate. But I think it does give you a good sense of, at the very least, people who are here today, and also those folks who are interested in it. I think there's some self-selection that goes on in these, and it's clear that there's a sizable chunk of your community that cares about these issues and wants to have these conversations. What we're going to do today, you're getting handouts. There's a lot more information in those handouts than we're going to get to, but I wanted you to have it to take it home with you. Because you're visiting Michigan State, which I welcome you to our campus. It's much prettier on sunny days, but hopefully the sun comes out. You'll at least have this to take back with you. So what we're going to cover today is however far we get based on your level of interest and the questions that you have or where you want to dive deeper. And the big thing that we're going to start with is comparing diversity and inclusion. I think that Jeff did a really good job already outlining for folks what he thinks diversity adds up to. Just as a reminder, your association actually has its own statement, which we really encourage folks to do. Have a statement out there for your members, but also for folks who are interested in joining your community. How do you feel about these issues, and where do you stand? What are those things that you're committed to doing and to doing better? So throughout the, this is not, help me with that. Oh, it's for the laser. Okay, so I have one in my purse. I'll grab it in a second. So there's lots of opportunity for interaction. And I always have this, I teach undergraduates as well as doing all these trainings, and I have the same participation guidelines everywhere I go. In a nutshell, I'm not going to ask you to share anything that you don't want to share. I would never put anyone on the spot like that. To the extent that you are willing to share, either at your tables or with a larger group, know that everybody benefits from that. Hearing other people's perspectives is invaluable and much more persuasive than anything I could share for you coming in as an outsider. We want to make sure we're giving folks our full attention. Stepping up and stepping back is just a good rule of thumb. You want to make sure that no one person is dominating the conversation. There's room for other folks. There's going to be disagreements that happens. Hopefully it happens in a respectful way. And we hear each other, assuming that folks are here with the best of intentions and really trying to grapple with this stuff. I can't guarantee that anything you share in here is not going to be shared outside of this space, but I ask you to honor each other's confidences if someone provides some personal information. The thing about diversity and inclusion is it's never done, so you have to kind of expect and also accept not just the discomfort, but also the non-closure. We're certainly not going to accomplish everything in the time we have together today, but even if we were together for days or years, it's never done. This stuff is constantly evolving. It's very context specific. And so even people like myself who do this every day, we're always learning. We're always growing. And depending on what's happening on your campus, what's happening in your community, what's happening in the national context or international context, all of this stuff changes. And so if you're somebody who likes to think very black and white and have like some clear guidelines and concrete, like just tell me the things to say or not to say, we can't really do that. There are certainly wrong things to do that we're going to try to avoid, but there's so many other ways of entering this, and it's never done. And so hopefully you'll join me in kind of embracing the gray areas of this work, because that's really what you need to come to expect. And then the last thing you always want to make sure, or at least I always try to make sure, that there's room for people to make mistakes. If you can't ask the question here, if you can't say something here that may not come out as tactfully as you would hope, where else are you going to do it? This is the space to have that opportunity. And if folks feel like they can't do that, then usually what happens is that the growing and the learning stops because they feel like they can't. There's not a safe place for them to enter, or they're afraid to say or do the wrong thing. And so then they just give up. And we certainly don't want that to happen. So hopefully this is a room where you can embrace that. Okay, so moving into, now I'm stuck. I don't know what happened. It's not moving at all now. Is this that one? Okay. All right. So what I'm going to ask you to do for just a second, Jeff's already given you some good primers, but let's think for just a moment. We'll give you 1 or 2 minutes just to quietly reflect internally. What are some reasons why you think it's important to have an inclusive environment, either in your association, in the planetarium field, in your planetariums specifically? Why do you think an inclusive environment is something that we should pursue? So just take 1 or 2 minutes to give that some thought. I'm going to grab a different clicker. Okay, we'll give you just a few more seconds to finish your thoughts. Okay, who would like to share? What are some examples, some reasons you came up with an inclusive environment matters? Yes?
Because it's the right thing to do.
This is the right thing to do. Okay, thank you. What else? Yes?
Use scientific knowledge. If you're not valuing the contributions of everybody, then the science is skewed. For example, I used to teach a lot of young women who would go around saying things like, I'm subnormal. And the reason they would say I'm subnormal is because their body temperature was not 98.6. And it got me thinking, 98.6 is such a fallacy. In the first place, it's way too precise, even not counting gender difference. It's way too precise a number for something as diverse as body temperature. And secondly, women normally have a body temperature half the time that's below even 97, and maybe in the other half might get a little bit above 98, and a woman's temperature is never 98.6 unless she's sick or pregnant.
So you learn something new every day.
Going around saying that normal is 98.6, I had all of these young women going around thinking they're subnormal, so it's damaging to them. But it's also giving a very skewed and misinterpretation of what if you say 98.6 and nothing else, the room, even the most elite scientists will say body temperature.
Sure. Yeah. So 2 things pointed out there for folks on the other side. Number 1, we're not all 98.6. But what I really appreciate is that the data is inaccurate. You're missing important pieces. In any conversation, if you've got different perspectives or experiences and only some of them are being included, then you don't have the whole picture. But the other thing is that without the whole picture, it can lead some folks to feel deviant or dysfunctional because their experience doesn't map onto whatever they're being told is normal. Thank you. That's great. Yep.
I think being inclusive promotes more innovation.
Promotes innovation. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. What else? Yes.
I mean, we have had people leave our profession because they haven't felt included. So
Sure.
we are
Yeah.
losing perspective already.
Right. So inclusion is going to build retention, and it will add to the variety of perspectives. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So with Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Yes.
which is psychological research, if your psychological needs have not been met, then you can't be self-actualization, and so you can't learn. And in
Sure. Yep, so if your psychological needs are not being met, then that's going to impact your cognitive functioning. Yeah, absolutely.
We work with visitors all the time, and if we're not enabling them to see themselves in our field, how are we going to get more people? I may be a great example for young girls, but young blonde white girls in my community has a strong African American presence. I'm not enabling them necessarily to fully see themselves in our field.
Sure.
And I would love to get more people that would make them feel like they could come into the field.
Absolutely. So it's about modeling and recruitment. Right? If you're representing only one piece of the picture, and then you've got new folks who are considering entering the field, whether they're very young or even in college, are there people there who look like me? Is this a space where I would be welcome? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Looking at things from many different perspectives can give you a better, a more well-rounded picture.
Yes. Yeah. Better, more perspectives, more well-rounded picture. Absolutely. There's one other hand over here. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Including the staff, no matter what their level, allows them to have ownership.
Sure, yeah. So including all folks, regardless of their level, gives everyone some ownership, some stake in the game, right? A sense of investment, absolutely. All of those work, that's absolutely right. And thank you very much. I'm excited that there are so many folks on board with this already. You're already thinking ahead. I'm going to show you an image, and I'm going to ask you to think about what it is that you see in this picture. And there are many answers. So what do we see here? What's happening?
I see people making assumptions based on a very limited amount of feedback.
Okay, so assumptions based on a limited amount of
Feedback.
Okay?
They're all right and they're all wrong.
They're all right and they're all wrong. Okay? What does that mean?
It means that each person is right when they analyze a specific portion of the whole, but none of them see the whole.
Okay, great, thank you. What else? Yeah?
Lack of communication.
Lack of communication. What else? Yep.
One irritated elephant.
Yes, he is. Does look a little disgruntled there. Yeah. What else? Yeah?
6 white scientists.
Okay, 6 white scientists. All right. What else? Yep.
Dogmatism.
Dogmatism. So what does that mean? Tell us.
The exclamation point.
Right.
This is the way it is.
Absolutely. So punctuation matters, right? This is not a question mark. It's a wall.
Yeah.
It's a wall. It's not a period like, oh, it's a wall. They are sure it's a wall, exclamation point, or it's a snake, right? What else do we see? They're blindfolded, yep, absolutely. So even their senses are limited, their own personal senses are limited.
The only person not in a lab coat is the woman.
Okay, yep,
Good.
yep. So either she's got a little extra flair or she's not the scientist. Mm-hmm. Yes. It's about perspective. So what does that mean?
What is their perspective is their truth.
Sure. Yep. Anything else? Yeah.
It looks like a stethoscope and the one guy's talking. I'm thinking perhaps different professions with one object.
Sure. So the only one stethoscope that we can see, so maybe it's different levels of analysis. So you've got like a medical version versus some other sciences. Yeah? Anything else? Are there any folks in the room who are afraid of snakes? Yeah. Any of us? Okay. So for those of us who are not fans of snakes, this experience on the bottom might be a little traumatic, right? So for some folks, they love snakes. They're like into reptiles. That's a cool thing. Like it'd be really fun. Like, ooh, it's a snake. And then for other folks, they'd be like, ah, it's a snake, right? Like very different reactions to the same thing. And so all of this, and including just the exercise of breaking down what you're seeing, is how diversity and inclusion works. That it is your truth. It is what's right in front of you. Even if it's right in front of you, you may not see everything. And if you're not listening to other folks, you still don't have the whole picture. So these are clearly, we can assume, based on their wardrobes at least, we're going to assume these are well-educated people. If they were listening to each other, they would figure out very quickly, well, we can't all have different things. This must be something else. But because they're not hearing each other, they're missing the bigger picture. And that's the way diversity and inclusion works. There are different perspectives, there are different experiences, and those are valid. If you're afraid of snakes and you think you've found a snake, that's how you're going to react. You have found that snake. That is a real truth, regardless of anything else. On top of that, the experiences around diversity and inclusion feel different to different people. For some folks, they've never had any experience with diversity, so this is all new and uncomfortable. For other folks, their experiences in diversity have been very painful, traumatic. They've not been received warmly. They have not been welcomed in that space. And every time they enter into that space, they're on alert. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of the consequences of bias is what it does to the person. So to go back to what happens if your psychological needs are not met. For people who are consistently experiencing on a daily basis macro and microaggressions, their amygdala is always firing. They are always in fight or flight mode. And what that means is that the cortisol, that stress hormone, is always pumping through their blood all the time. And by the end of the day, when they go to bed, their cortisol levels are higher than other folks. And then when they go to bed at night, their sleep is disrupted. They don't get to sleep at the same time. They don't sleep as long. They don't get the same deep rest that you need to reset the cortisol. So when they wake up in the morning, their cortisol levels are already higher than other folks before their day has even started. And so what that means over the lifespan is a cumulative buildup of cortisol, increased hypertension, increased risks of heart disease and cardiovascular disease, obesity, all because of that cortisol. It's so significant, in fact, that if you were to measure someone's rates as someone in their middle age, you can actually assess what was their experience with discrimination as teenagers, because that's the only explanation for how it would get that high by the time they're in their 40s and their 50s. Similarly, for women who experience macro and microaggressions on a daily basis around any piece of their identity, they're actually passing that cortisol through the bloodstream in utero to the fetus, so that when babies of color are born, their cortisol levels are already higher than white babies. So on one hand, lots of professional implications, but on the other hand, just basic human level, like functioning, well-being, all of that comes into play as well. So this is the way diversity and inclusion works. You have to make space for both and. Your experience is real, and you may not share the same experiences that someone else has had. Our instinct oftentimes is to be defensive or dismiss something. When someone brings it to our attention, well, this is how it's been for me, or this is how that felt, or this feels to me. And if it doesn't map on to how our experience is or how we're feeling, we want to dismiss it. It's not in line with our worldview or our perspective, and so we shut it down. And that's where the inclusion stops. Or if you've got folks in spaces where you're not listening to them, you're not hearing them, they're not allowed to contribute or make suggestions or raise concerns. Ultimately, you lose those options, you lose those benefits, and folks are going to stop participating and sometimes will actually remove themselves from those communities altogether. So diversity works as both and. When I was talking to Shannon about how this would translate, what would be a way to put this into the language for folks in your community who maybe haven't thought about this before, but you've got a lot of expertise in other areas. What would be another way of thinking about this? And so we thought about the stars, and we thought about the hemispheres, and that diversity and inclusion functions in exactly the same way in that space as well. What you see above you in the sky is absolutely there. That's your truth. That's reality. But that is not the whole picture. And if you don't have the whole picture, if you don't open yourself up to the possibility that someone on the other side of the world has a different sky, then you don't really understand what you're doing. So you have to have space for your own truth. You also have to have space for other truths, other perspectives. And my favorite meme probably in the last month that's come up through this search is this one.
Yes.
If the earth was flat, cats would push everything off of it by now, right? So we know, because we still have stuff on earth, the cats haven't pushed it all off, we know that there is more to the sky than what's directly above us. But if you're not open to the possibility that there's other stuff out there, that's all you see. That's all you know. You have the benefit of science and education and your expertise to explain to folks why the Earth is not flat, why we see different stars in the sky, why they change with the seasons. It's very much the same thing as thinking about diversity and inclusion with people. And that each of us is our own little star. Okay. So benefits of an inclusive environment. You guys have already touched on most of them, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. For me, the big issues here are open lines of communication, trust, reliability, accountability, transparency. Can you ask questions? Can you make suggestions? Can you raise concerns? Can you ask for help? Or does that actually make you more vulnerable? If you admit that you need help, if you admit that you're overwhelmed or you don't understand something, you need additional resources, how is that interpreted based on your identity? If we have an inclusive environment, you guys have already touched on most of these. What are the benefits? What I want to go into here real quickly is the idea of capitalizing on talent and ideas and problem solving. There's going to be 2 examples I'm going to give you that are kind of like high profile in the news stories of diversity and inclusion gone wrong. So one is a Pepsi commercial that was on last year, and it involved Kendall Jenner. Does anybody remember this commercial?
Yeah.
Okay. Who can tell us what was the Kendall Jenner, what was that commercial, Pepsi's commercial? Lots of people said yes, now we have to describe it. Shannon? She gave a Pepsi to police officers in riot gear. What else do we remember? Anything else? Who else can help us? Yeah?
It totally solved the conflict, like it's
Sure, so the Pepsi resolved the conflict. Anything else we remember? Either about the commercial or how it was received.
Protesters were those of minorities?
The protesters were what?
Those of minorities?
There were several minorities in the audience. It's not really clear what they were protesting, but it came out, that commercial was released in the midst of several Black Lives Matter protests that had gotten national attention. And so, as we do, people connected dots that weren't explicitly there and started to assume, what would they be protesting? Yeah. Anything else we remember? Okay. So this is a couple screenshots of that commercial. There is a protest that's coming. It's not clear what folks are protesting, but you can see there's a peace sign there. And the way the scene is set, there is a group of folks marching down the street with signs towards a line of police officers, some of whom, though not all, are in riot gear. So you can see this guy right here. But some of them are not, and that still bothers me. Like Pepsi couldn't just put the extra $2,000 in for uniforms, I'm not sure. But Kendall Jenner comes out. She is not part of the protest, but she comes upon the protest and sees that these folks are going to square off together. And you can feel almost this like palpable tension, right, between the protesters who are marching and then the police who are like anticipating their arrival. And she approaches one of the officers with a Pepsi, and he opens it and he drinks from it, and then he smiles, and now is figuratively broken the ice. And now everybody's cheering, and so she gets lots of high fives and thumbs up from the protesters, thank goodness for Kendall Jenner and her Pepsi. So here's the deal. What happened with this commercial was not well received. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. For those of you who remember, several decades ago, Coca-Cola had a commercial. Similar political climate in terms of very polarized political views. And Coca-Cola at that time was not the leading soft drink. Pepsi was at that point. And they released a commercial where there were a group of diverse folks on top of a hill. And they started drinking Coke, and now they're singing and they're happy, and it's like we have found peace because this is the one thing we all share in common, right? Despite all of our differences, we all love Coke, and that's what we can rally around. That commercial was so successful, it buoyed Coke way ahead of Pepsi, made them the #1 soft drink for many years after that. If you watch those TV shows every year, they have like the best commercials ever. That Coca-Cola commercial is still in the top 10 all these years later. So it didn't happen in a vacuum that Pepsi decided this is our moment. We find ourselves again in a political climate that's deeply polarized. We can use this just as Coca-Cola did for the next generation. The problem is that it was tone deaf. It significantly minimized not just the risk, but the violence and the brutality that the Black Lives Matter protests are protesting. Right? That this is not just a difference of political views. These are lives on the ground. These are lives every day that are impacted by the risk of being on the ground. And so to suggest that a Pepsi is going to absolve this is very insulting. It's offensive. But this is an expensive commercial. Think about all the people that would have had to sign off on this commercial. This is a multi-million-dollar ad. They didn't bring in just any beautiful woman who's going to give out a Pepsi. They brought in a Kardashian. These women do not just show up for free. So there are people at the highest level of the Pepsi company saying this is going to work. And nobody stopped. Nobody saw where this was going. Within 24 hours after that ad was released, they had to pull it. And then they had to issue many formal apologies for the PR disaster they created all by themselves. Did not need to happen. And they went there because they didn't have diversity, or they had diversity and they didn't have inclusion in the room with folks who were making these decisions. I'm going to give you one more example to help you see how this works. H&M fashion catalog. Anybody remember what happened to them just a few months ago? Oh, we got an oh man, so maybe? Is that ringing any bells? Who remembers anything? I've got the image if we don't have anybody who can fill it in. Yeah, go ahead.
Wasn't it a little boy wearing something that was not that great and you picked out for him?
Yes. Yep, you are on the right track. There's a monkey involved, yep. What else? Oh, so now we have some groans. So you maybe, even if you don't know, you can guess where this is going. Does anybody else want to fill in the blanks? Okay. So here's another one. So H&M fashion catalog, they're an international company. They're based out of the UK. Oh, yeah, see, all the groans. See, if they had just brought it to the Planetarium Association, they would have avoided this whole mess. So when you go online to buy clothes, you can click different icons and see, like, well, I want to see what it looks like in red or in black, and it pops up with a different image, sometimes also with a different model. So H&M's fashion catalog for their winter catalog, they had two young boys in hoodies. And the young black boy, as you can see, his sweatshirt says coolest monkey in the jungle. That by itself would have been a bad idea. You're talking about centuries of folks, in particular white folks, European folks, referring to Africans, folks of African descent, and then here in the United States, African Americans. We even have caricatures in our newspapers just not that long ago. Even in Australia, just last month, Serena Williams depicted her as a monkey in one of their cartoons. So we have lots of centuries of evidence of white folks and Europeans referring to those of African descent as monkeys, as primates, as less evolved than other human beings. And so that alone is going to be a red flag. But what happens next is that it's juxtaposed with this young white boy. So you click on the orange sweatshirt, a different model pops up. He is of European descent, and his sweatshirt reads survival expert. So here you have a company based in the UK with a kid of European descent who is going to go in and physically dominate the space where this young black boy lives. And so it reeks of colonialism, and Twitter had a lot to say about it. There's a lot to say about a lot of things.
Oh boy.
There were several celebrities who immediately pulled their sponsorships from H&M. H&M said, no, we didn't mean for this, that's not what we meant to happen. And those celebrities said, that's fine. We don't need to be associated with the company that's that ignorant either. Like, if you didn't mean for this to happen, you should have at least known that this was going to happen, and you didn't see it coming. And so, similar to Pepsi, they had to issue a formal public apology. They had to revamp their catalog. This is a little complicated, though. The mother of the young black model here came out and issued her own public statement and said, look, I was there all day. He's in multiple outfits. I had to approve all of them. I didn't have a problem with this. I don't know why folks are making a big deal out of it. This is why micro and macroaggressions, particularly microaggressions, are so complicated. Not everybody is going to agree on them. It's about history, it's about context, it's about delivery, who's delivering it, how are they delivering it. All of that stuff matters, and not everybody is going to agree with it. The mother was fine with it. Millions of people around the world were not fine with it. And what we talk about in our office and just in this work in general, it's not about intent, it's about impact. You may not have meant for that to happen. In fact, we can be reasonably certain that this was not the intention of Pepsi or H&M. They didn't look to create these holes for themselves. That was not their goal. But ultimately, the consequences were the same. The impact that it had on their consumers and on the public were the same either way. So if you intended it or not, if there are some folks who feel less comfortable than others, if there are some folks who feel more welcomed or supported than others, those are going to have the same consequences either way. And so that's the way we try to think about this. So in both of those examples, there's only two answers. Either there's no diversity in the room and the folks who are signing off on these decisions, or there's diversity but it's not inclusive. Because if it were an inclusive space, you would have folks who are saying, hold on, let me tell you how this is going to go. Maybe we want to rethink this. Is there another way we could deliver whatever we're trying to deliver without all of these unintended consequences attached to it? And if you've got a space that's not inclusive, those folks are not going to participate. Either nobody is asking them, or they have stuck their neck out enough times that they're done trying. Because they're always the ones, and people remind them all the time. You always have to bring this up. Why do you always have to make it about this and this? And oftentimes it's folks who are already marginalized. So they're going to stop making themselves more vulnerable and just put their head down and get their work done. And then you lose the ability to collaborate or to seize those opportunities where all of those different perspectives could really benefit everyone in the room or in the space. Does that make sense to you folks? Okay, all right. So then there's just additional data for you here about how companies in general, regardless of industry, all benefit from having diversity and inclusion in those spaces where folks are making decisions or they're in positions of power. That's important. Who's making the hiring decisions? Who's the narrator on your programs? What are the different cultures that you're reflecting? All of that stuff sends signals, either intentionally or unintentionally, to your staff and also to your constituents. And so the other thing to think about here is that we are moving rapidly towards a more diverse environment. So the percentage of folks who identify as LGBT is increasing every year. Those folks of color, millennials, if you're talking about not just millennials, but now at this point, Gen Z, so anyone who's under age 18, that's over half of those kids are not white. At the same time that that's happening, all of the baby boomers are retiring. So what I try to help folks understand is that this is coming, this wave is coming one way or the other. And so you can find ways to embrace that and do it in a way that is successful, or you can get uncomfortable about it and it will just make it difficult and still prolong the inevitable. It's happening one way or the other. And so diversity is just as much about the well-being of individuals as it is a business plan. You've got to be prepared for the long game. And if you're not thinking about it, there will be consequences. Okay, so in your handouts, I've got a little purple circle for you here. This is just meant to represent any one person, and the idea is that we have multiple identities happening at the same time. We have many more identities than just these, but these are the ones that we have a tendency to compartmentalize folks into. There's a physical cue, there's an auditory cue, there's something that we see or we hear that signals to us what we think is that person's identity. And the issue is you don't even have to be right. If you think it's real, then it's real in its consequences. So if you approach someone and you assume that their gender is X, and you assume that their race is X, and you assume that their social class is X, whatever that means to you, that's how you're going to engage with them. And what's important to understand is that people are doing that to you at the same time. So part of the reason all of these miscommunications happen is because everybody is working with their best guess, and that's not good enough. And if you're not used to existing in spaces that are diverse, if you have no experience with folks in that community, if you're not part of that community, you're going to make more assumptions that are even more dangerous. So these are some of those identities, but there are many more, including what was highlighted in your handout around marital status, veteran status. There's also issues of the introverts versus extroverts, which everybody, the introverts especially, appreciate that I point out to folks. So extroverts I lovingly refer to as the golden retrievers of the world. Right? They just love people. They love people. Introverts get a really bad rap. Right? People assume that introverts don't like people. It's not that introverts don't like people, it's that people are exhausting. It takes a lot of energy to deal with people. And if you're in a job, and some of you are, where you're interfacing with the public, hundreds, maybe thousands of people every day, that's exhausting if you're an introvert. And so for these folks, when they go on break, they may have their earbuds in, they may go by themselves. If they go to lunch, they might sit with you, but they're probably not going to talk. They're not going out after work with you. And the assumption that people make about them is that they're cold, they're antisocial, they're not approachable, and that's not it. It's that they have different energy. And if you don't understand that about them, you'll read them differently. This happens to also work across lines of gender and race, though. So what we see happen is frequently people's behaviors are interpreted differently, depending on who's delivering them. And so you've got introverts versus extroverts. If you add on top of that gender, for men who are introverted, we have all these sexy words. They're reserved, they're stoic, they're mysterious, the lone wolves, right? Like we have all of these very romantic ideas about introverted men. Women get one phrase and one phrase only, and I know it's early, but it's resting bitch face. That's the phrase that we get, right? So for women, we are regularly asked, why aren't you smiling? And not in a way that's compassionate and like, oh, you seem to really be having a difficult day today. I see you're not smiling. That's not it. Why aren't you smiling is the question that we are asked because we're not doing our jobs. You're warm, you're gracious, you're invitational. And if you're not smiling, then you're not doing your job. You're making me uncomfortable. Some women have even reported being directed to smile. You need to smile more. It makes people uncomfortable. Or you look prettier when you smile. Those are the things that happen. If you add on top of that race, it takes a very different turn. So for folks of color who are introverted, same exact behaviors, now they're not just cold, antisocial, or unapproachable. Now they're angry, they're threatening, and they're intimidating. So now it becomes this added layer of violence added to the exact same behavior. All of this stuff is happening, and you're just walking around trying to live your life. People are reading you based on these identities, and we're doing it to them at the same time. Where all of those come together, that intersection is your standpoint. So the idea of your standpoint, I use a metaphor of driving regularly. If you think about driving a car, you have a rear view mirror and your side mirrors. The newer cars have these little buzzers that go off if there's anybody in your blind spots, right? We have all of this equipment to help us avoid an accident. And people have accidents all the time. Still happens, right? So the idea of your standpoint is that you are in your car and you can see whatever's around you. You may go the extra step and read some books, watch some documentaries, get to know some different kinds of people, all of those extra tools to help you see those things that are not in your immediate purview, but you're still going to have blind spots. And if you've got a passenger in your seat that says, hold on, there's a motorcycle coming up your side, it is your responsibility to attend to that. If you hit a vehicle with all of those tools, it is still your responsibility to attend to that. And so life functions the same way. You have what's available to you. You have additional resources. But not everything is going to line up with what you're expecting. And so what I really encourage folks to do is start expecting it to be unexpected. Start expecting it to not go the way you assume it's going to go, because more than likely, that's what's going to happen. It's not going to go the way you think it's going to go. You've got lots of language here for folks. I'm not going to spend the time on this. I do invite you, though, to make sure if you're not familiar with the vocabulary that you start to pay attention to it, including the language for different forms of racism, discrimination, harassment, transphobia, etc. I want to move in, though, to bias so that we can use the time that we've got together as efficiently as possible. So bias is just an opinion. It's favorable or unfavorable about a person or a particular group of people. You've got your standpoint. That's your frame of reference. You either are this person, or you know this person, or you know other people like this person. And so that's your frame of reference. If you don't know that person or anyone like them, then where do you get that information from? For most of us, it's in the media. And depending on your source, that's going to mean different things. What did your parents tell you? What did your friends tell you? What does your religious affiliation tell you? What does your community think about this? And what did you see on the news? What was on Law and Order last night? That's where all the information comes from, if it's not an immediate frame of reference. The thing about bias that's really important for folks to know, it's universal. We all do this, including me. We all have bias. And so we typically respond defensively. If somebody brings something to us and says, you know, when you said or did this, it was hurtful, it was harmful, it was inappropriate. The ego is very fragile. And so our instinct is to protect that at all costs. And so we react defensively. And we say, well, I didn't mean it that way. Or you're overreacting, you're taking it too sensitively. Or it was a joke. All the ways we can deflect, right? And put it back on the person who had the feelings as opposed to taking responsibility and ownership for whatever we have said and done in that moment. I really try to encourage people, if somebody brings you that information, lean into it. They brought it to you because they think that you care. They brought it to you because they think you want to do better. If somebody brings that to you, thank them and ask how you can do better. And then commit to doing better. That's the next step. But part of this is just accepting that this is universal. Just forgive yourself immediately that you're going to do this all the time. I still do this even though I teach it every single day. I find myself, oh my gosh, wow, there it is. Yep, still there. Still need to work on that, right? It doesn't go away. So if you can be comfortable with that, then the self-awareness is not so threatening. So it's everywhere. We have a tendency to favor our own groups. And group can be anything. There's a disproportionate number of people who are married who share the same name or the same first initial, or they share the same birth date. Why? Because it's an amazing icebreaker. Like, oh my gosh, we're the same birthday, or you're the same birthday as somebody in my family or something, right? It just starts a conversation that you wouldn't have otherwise had. And so groups can be very insignificant. They can also be very significant in terms of core pieces of your identity. Why does this happen? We already talked about the amygdala, that fight or flight, all the way back to prehistoric times. You had one job to do with your little lizard brain, and that was to survive, right? That was it. That was your job. So you had to accurately identify the approach of a predator before it got to you. If you were wrong, or you took too long, that's the end of your gene pool. So the amygdala is still there. It still does the exact same thing. The difference is we have this big, beautiful brain now that's capable of lots of critical thinking. You can ask questions. Most of us do not exist in a world where every encounter is the potential between life and death. There are a handful of professions that live in that world. The rest of us do not. You have time to ask questions. You have time to reserve judgment. You have Google. You can find all the things, right? You don't need to jump immediately into that. But the brain does not like gaps of information. It's trying to be efficient and generates a formula outside of your awareness very quickly. Within a split second, you have already decided what you can anticipate. What can I expect from someone who looks like this, who's coming into my planetarium, who's coming in for a job interview, who's in a parking lot, and it's just the two of us. Your brain is already running that formula outside of your awareness. And so you've got the amygdala, and then you've also got those mental shortcuts, filling in those gaps of information. And the less you know, the more gaps of information, the harder your brain is going to work, and the more mistakes you're going to make in the long run. If you were to go to Google, because Google is there, we'll see if this works in terms of technology. Oops. Where did it go? There we go. All right, so if you go to Google and you do Chief Executive Officer, you already know where this is going, right? Probably don't even need to open it, but for the non-believers, there you go. We're still going. Still going. Still going. There we go. Here's someone who is not white. And I'm not sure where the women are.
Oh, way higher up.
We passed one up? Okay. We passed one. Okay. So that's the idea, right? So the reason I bring that up, though, for you is to see for yourselves what happens, right? So your brain is going to rely on these heuristics. And heuristics are shortcuts. So what happens if somebody looks a particular way and it's not what you're expecting? What happens if somebody comes in for a job interview and they want a space in your staff and they don't look like anyone else looks in your space? What happens if you've already hired this person and they need help? What happens if the productivity declines and their work starts to suffer? Do you start asking questions about what can we do to support you? Is there anything else going on in your life? Or do we immediately jump to this person's not capable, qualified, competent enough to be here? Those heuristics are really dangerous because there are folks who look the part just by walking in the door. They get the benefit of the doubt. And then there are other folks who do not, who have a much steeper hill to climb. They've got to work, as Shannon pointed out, for some folks feeling like they have to work harder to prove they deserve to be there than other folks because they don't look the part. And so that's what your brain does in those moments. An example of that we'll consider in just a moment, how you can interrupt this. You've got your automatic and your controlled. Your brain is doing two things. If you think about, for example, when you learned to read the constellations, when you learned all the ways in which they are presented, and seasons and hemispheres and all of those things, that's all controlled processing. So that if I pulled up a map, you would have answers immediately, automatically. But it took years of intentionality and practice to get your head around that. And now you're trying to help other folks with that, and it's very complicated. So that's the automatic versus the controlled. Professional athletes, professional musicians, people who are fluent in another language, all of that is automatic. But that comes after years of deliberate intention. And so your implicit bias functions in the same way. You can interrupt it through self-awareness. You can shift your brain from automatic to controlled with self-awareness, with that intentionality. If you remind yourself, oh, I don't know this person's whole story. I often talk to folks about the importance of getting to know people's stories. I encourage you to go back and do that with your staff. Who are you? How did you get to be the person that you are? Why do you do what you do? What is it about you that people don't know that would help them understand you better? And what is it about them that they can share with you? That will build an inclusive space faster than anything else. Because now you're people. Now you're whole people who have real lives outside of what you do. And it will help you understand their idiosyncrasies and their passions and the ways in which we can be more compassionate. And they will have the same response to you. You'll also make the most uncanny connections with people that you never... When I do this with my students, it cracked me up. I had one semester where I had 3 students in a class of 19 who all had pet rats. I don't know, not sure what that was about with the sociology seniors there, but that's a weird thing to all of a sudden be like, oh my gosh, you do rats too? I love rats, right? Somebody else who was home brewing, they did home brewing beer for several years, and there was someone else who wanted to learn, and now they found each other. These majors, these sociology majors, had been together for 4 or 5, some of them 6 years, never knew each other until that class in their senior year. So think about what that would do for your staff to slow down, move yourself to the controlled processing, ask the questions before you go into automatic. This is another example here. This was a real example. OneLogin.com, software company, and they wanted to do some recruitment. We want to hire some new young folks. We want them to know that we embrace inclusion and that it's a fun place to work. We'll take a couple headshots of some of our current employees with a corny caption about why they like working for us. So they did. They posted several of them. Isis Wenger was the only headshot that elicited any kind of controversy. And so I'll show you 2 of the captions here to this picture. So she's a real person with a real job as a software engineer at OneLogin.com. So over here, this is some weird haphazard branding. I think they'd like to appeal to women, but are probably just appealing to dudes. Perhaps that's the intention all along, but I'm curious people with brains find this quote remotely plausible, and if women in particular buy this image of what a female software engineer looks like, I don't know, weird. So then there are several people who write in, what should a female software engineer look like if that's not it? And then down here in the bottom post here, if their intention is to attract more women, then it would have been better to choose a picture with a warm, friendly smile rather than a sexy smirk. So this is what happens. This is what happens. The first part is going back to the heuristics. What does a software engineer look like? And what happens if you don't look the part? And you're applying for majors, and you're applying for internships, and you're applying for jobs. Or you get the job, and now you're trying to get a promotion. What happens if you don't look the part to those folks? The other side of that is how we interpret behavior differently. So for some folks, they would say, this is the warm, friendly smile. But apparently to others, this is sexy. And it's a smirk, like there's something else going on there. And so for a lot of women, they find themselves in this position, particularly women who have educations and they have successful careers. Well, what's the quickest way to cut her down? Objectify her. That's a pretty quick route. So both of those things happen. And again, we actually know more about her than you do about the average person. We can reasonably assume her education, because we've got her occupation. If she were just out there in the world, she would just be another woman. We know more about her than the average person we would encounter. And even with those gaps of information filled in, folks are inclined to move in another direction. So where does it come from? We mentioned direct and indirect messages, your friends, your family, your parents, your neighbors, religious organizations, community organizations, the news, TV shows, movies. This happens at a very young age, so even kids that are pre-verbal have already decided who is safe or not safe. What faces are warm and trustworthy and friendly, and what faces are not, based on how they're exposed. Who are they exposed to? And how do my parents react when we're around people like that? This is an important piece of information. When is it most likely to happen? You are most likely to be your worst selves on your worst days. Does that make sense? Yep, okay. So when you are having a day, that is the day you cannot afford to be on autopilot. Because you will say and do things that you don't mean to do. And they will come out. Any of that bias that's there, that's when it's going to sneak out. So that ambiguous and incomplete information. How many of you folks interface with the public regularly? You don't know anything about them, right? Nothing. And yet, you've got to interact with them. So how do you read them? How do you respond to them? If somebody gets lost and away from the group, how do we interpret that? Those are the kinds of questions to start thinking about. Time constraints. Does anybody feel like there's just not enough hours in the day? Right? Yeah. So that happens. Usually time constraints are brought together with fatigue and high emotions. There's not enough hours in the day. Well, how are we going to fix that? We're going to stay up later. We're going to work later. We're going to get up earlier. And while we're sleeping, many of us have disrupted sleep. So I wake up frequently right at 3 o'clock. And it happens so frequently that now I'm just annoyed with it. Like I can already guess what time it is. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. So that happens, and then you're up and you're like, I'm going to think about my day or the things that happened yesterday or the things I still need to do, all of that stuff. Then you finally go into work. You're exhausted before you've even started your day. So that fatigue kicks in. High emotions is elevated emotions in either direction. So either very positive or very negative emotions. Either way, if you're up in your head, like cloud space emotions, you're not seeing what matters. You're missing important cues because you're emotional. So it's flooding your judgment there. And then also if you have a lot on your minds. If you feel like you're treading water, if you feel like you're drowning, you're going to be very selective about who gets your time and attention and energy. So take your immediate family and your best friends out of the picture, because obviously we all have very close relationships. But think about everybody else. If you go into work in the morning and you've got 30 minutes before your first meeting and you've got 100 emails in your inbox, who do you answer? All right, well, we'll make sure your boss is done, right? You're immediately in triage mode, so make sure all your boss's emails are responded to. Then who else do you have time for? Start paying attention to those patterns. We have an alumni here in the College of Social Science. She is the Vice President of Human Resources over at Coca-Cola. One of the changes that they made, which I think is fascinating, is that now whenever group emails are sent, the address line is alphabetized automatically. Because people could figure out who you were forgetting through your emails because they were like the last person to be added, right? Oh, Julie. Oh, I always forget Julie, right? Sometimes Julie doesn't even get it. She gets like a follow-up email, like, here's the thread I forgot to copy you on, right? So those kinds of things, they're not intentional, but they send a clear signal about who's in the inner circle, who matters, and who doesn't. So those are the kinds of things to think about. If you have 5 minutes and somebody comes to your office, who gets the time? Who do you actually stop and give your time to? And if there's a pattern there, pay attention to it. Who are the people that you're more likely to give your time to than not? Outside of your immediate circle. Those matter. How can you help with this? One very quick way is to breathe. Seems really obvious, but we forget to breathe. When babies are born, they automatically breathe diaphragmatically. Okay? So their lungs expand, and then they shrink. And then they expand, and then they shrink. And they're breathing for 5-6 seconds, right? For adults, by the time you get to our age and older, we are under stress all the time. When you're under stress, you breathe shallow. You're not breathing normally, naturally. You're also not breathing deeply. So making sure that you're breathing in 5-6 seconds and then out always more than you breathe in. So breathing out 6, 7 seconds to get the stale air out of your lungs. That's an important piece of this. That will reduce your heart rate. It lowers your blood pressure. When I do this in trainings that people that have Fitbits, they actually watch their heart rates drop just by breathing. You can actually feel the whole room change. So we're going to do that in here real quickly, okay? So I'm going to count in for 5 and then out for 7. Okay, ready? In, 2, 3, 4, 5. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Can you feel how, I mean, you actually feel it. It's crazy to me how that happens. You can actually feel it. In those moments when you're having a day, don't forget to breathe. It will lower your heart rate. It will clear your thinking. So if you're in your head, all emotional, it will clear that. It'll also buy you time so that you won't have an automatic reaction. You will have a controlled response. Very different. So all of those things matter. I'm going to move you over to, we already talked about service and attention. I'm going to move you to an exercise. I need everybody to have a writing utensil. If you need one, ask a friend. Is there anyone that needs a writing utensil? Look at you all organized. There's a lot of pens at the conference. Shannon says there's no excuse if you have no, you shouldn't say that. She just said they were very generous with their pens. Okay, so what I'm going to do for you, and there's not a handout for this, but what I'm going to do for you, either write down or at least internally in your head, think about, I'm going to show you 10 pictures. These pictures rotate every 10 seconds. And you're going to think of the first 3 words that come to mind for each of these pictures. These are going to be people that you work with, people that come into your planetarium. They might be your neighbors, whatever the situation is. You're going to write down the first 3 words that come to mind for each person. Is everyone ready? Okay. Seconds is 10 seconds. So, what I'm going to have you do at your tables, if you don't know each other, introduce yourself, always start there. But talk about what you came up with. What were the words that you came up with? Did you notice any patterns? Were there any surprises for you? You were surprised by one of your reactions? Did you have different interpretations of similar images? And then where did these come from? You had to come up with words, so where did they come from?
I felt that too. It's like, I really want to see white woman, white, Asian, black, right, yeah, right, food, right, food is one successful, exactly. Right. I did professional. Chip on the shoulder, likely to be a protester. Strong, resolute, hardworking. Yeah, hardworking. More likely blue collar, She might have a skiing trip. Blonde, attractive. Yeah. First thing I saw was kind of threatening almost. Yeah, attitude. So ethnicity is not clear, but it's not what I'm familiar with. I just saw how they feel like I was wanting to make a statement. Not the other ones. He's not happy to be there. Some jump out at me more with ideas, and others like, what do I come up with?
Okay. I'm going to have you guys open it up now. I'm going to have you guys open it up to the larger group and hear from you. What did you find at your tables? What did you discover? Yes.
I found myself not actually writing the first three things that came to mind and like trying to like almost impress myself by what I would actually write down.
Or what you felt you should write down.
Write down the first three things.
Right.
That's how you would be as spiritual.
Right.
Reaction to something. Yeah, I was like, wait, no, but what
Yeah. Right.
And like, by the end of it, I was so exhausted by that.
Right. So in the social sciences, we call that cognitive dissonance. Yeah. So you immediately become aware of something that does not align with how you want to be, and there's that discomfort. It's usually visceral. But that's also why it goes every 10 seconds. Because we don't want you to have time to, because what happens if you spend too long in that, then it's gone, it's the next picture. In real life, you're doing that in 2 to 3 seconds without even that social awareness. So what you were doing is actually just switching from the automatic to the controlled processing. So even that alone is a useful exercise, right? That you became aware of, oh, that's my instinct. I don't want that to be my instinct. I have another choice. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
The background was just as important as and the outfit was just as important as the look
Right.
or the whatever.
Sure, right? Yep, so the gaps of information. We don't know anything about these people. We've got a headshot. So your brain is looking for anything it can grab to help you figure out who is this person. Absolutely. Yep, in the back.
There are people, the 3 guys mostly focus on the physical details, the picture.
Okay.
Where I have an emotion for everyone.
Sure, yeah. So some of us are emotional readers. Does anybody else look for like emotions, nonverbal cues? Yeah. So some of us do that, absolutely, yeah. Okay. Sure, yeah. So thinking about it again, that's the controlled processing. You're trying to figure out, I have a feeling, how do I put that into words? Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
My ADHD brain was going like, oh, that's some nice buttons, you know?
Nice buttons?
Yeah.
You're looking at, you're getting distracted by details?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that happen with regular interface also? Yeah. So that's good to know. It's good to know, absolutely, about yourself. Yeah, all the way in the window. Yep.
I didn't participate.
Okay.
But 5 people that did were all men
Okay.
of a generation.
Uh-huh.
And they had similar answers.
Sure. Yep. And why didn't you participate?
Because I was in the restroom.
Oh, okay. All right. Sometimes people have a different answer. I don't need to put you on the spot there. Sometimes people have a different answer where it's uncomfortable. I don't want to do this. So I just want to make sure that that wasn't the case. And so absolutely. So folks have, what you're suggesting is that folks who come from a certain generation or who share similar identities might have similar ideas. Mm-hmm. Might. You might. Yep.
I found it harder to come up with things for the people that look a little more typical. So you're middle-aged white man and you're middle-aged white woman.
Uh-huh.
Whereas the other ones as able to
Okay. So this guy was harder for you? Okay. We're quite sure what to do with that. All right. And then this person and that person also? You had a harder time with the white folks?
her, but not the younger.
Okay. All right. So maybe for you, there's an age barrier there, right? So these are my people, but also not really my people. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Did you give me that?
No.
Okay.
But I mean, so the one that made me uncomfortable,
Sure.
and mad at myself, was the young girl in the snow.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I looked at her and immediately went millennial.
Yeah.
And I think about how much I hate when people call me that.
Yeah.
And I hate when people make judgments based on my hair color, which is what I was doing to her.
Right.
So then I also wrote this judge.
Yeah, there you go. So you found some empathy there at the last minute there. That's great. And so this is absolutely, I mean, there's a reason I have this girl up here, or this young woman up here. And it is for that, it's complicated. Our reactions to young white women, they can either be very positive or they can be very judgmental and harsh. And so would you expect this person to be smart? Would you expect this person to be complicated? So those are the kinds of things to think about, right? Absolutely, yeah.
What's interesting is we have a granddaughter that looks very much like that.
Okay.
She's a brain.
Uh-huh.
So smart, so
Right.
And she just irritates the hell out of me because I'm scared for her.
Oh, you're scared. What are you scared for?
Because she looks too sexy.
Oh. Is she scared about that?
No.
Yeah. Yep. So those are the kinds. So when you see her, when you saw this picture, did you have kind of more nuanced responses to her? Yeah. So that's what happens. Frame of reference. You either are this person, you know this person, or you don't know anyone like this person. And then that's either positive or negative. And that's how we fill in those gaps. So for folks who are this person or know this person, is it an empathetic response, or is it like, oh, I know that girl, and she is not, right? Like, I don't want her on my team, right? Or do you know someone who's like that and like, wow, that's like one of the nicest people I've ever met. She would do anything for you. Those are the kinds of reactions. Or, you know, for folks, I tell people in the longer trainings regularly, I read as super white. I read as an older version of this young girl, right? The young folks refer to this as basic. That's the phrase that we use to describe someone like me. My hair is done, my nails are done, my shoes, I always have tall boots on, I drink Starbucks coffee, I drive a Subaru. If you were to look up white woman in the dictionary, that would be it. And yet, that's not my story. I'm from an interracial step family. I've lived in that family since I was 2.5 years old. When people meet me, they're expecting something very different than who I actually am. And so that's the kind of that's the reason why I was saying, like, get to know people's stories and help them know yours. It wasn't intuitive to me to tell people that ahead of time. I had an advisor in graduate school who was African American, and he said, let me tell you something. When you start teaching, you're going to need, on that first day, you're going over your syllabus, you're going to need to tell them your story. And I said, why do I need to tell them my story? And he said, because they're not going to understand why you're there. And I said, I have a PhD in sociology in race relations. Like, what more do I need to justify my space in that room? He said, it's not about you. It's not about you. It's distracting. You are distracting. So give them the information. Tell them your story, who you are, why you do what you do. Because everybody is going to be busy trying to figure out why they should listen to you. Why do you care? How could you possibly know? Why should we trust you? And so if you give them that, then you can get on the business of teaching. Get that out of the way first. And he was absolutely right. It was not intuitive to me at all. And one of the things that I try to help people with is to encourage you. I'm an overshare at this point, but this job has really kind of pushed me off the deep end. I have figured out that there's no space that's too vulnerable for me. I will give you all of the things. Because I've learned that it encourages other people to do the same thing. And so in that opportunity, at least with your staff, maybe not with the public who's coming in every day, but even with them, what are pieces that you can give to help them understand you and see you differently? Particularly if there are identity barriers, and it might be around race, it might be around gender, it might be around age. Who are the folks that, in the room of folks who said they've experienced age discrimination, it was on both ends. I encourage people regularly to think about age as a bridge. That is a universal experience. That's a window you can tap into, that you understand that people dismiss you, they talk down to you, they don't give you projects, they underestimate you around your age, either at the front end of your career or the back end of your career. So now imagine there's a piece of your identity, there is no sweet spot. You're never in the middle where people finally respect you. You finally have enough gray hair for people to take you seriously, but not too much where people start thinking you're slowing them down, right? Can you use that as a bridge to help you understand this is what other people deal with every day, and it's never going to change. It's never going to change about them. We're the ones that are going to have to change for them. Yeah.
I was wondering about when you encounter a group of people, like a group of young women,
Sure.
a group of old men,
Yeah.
any type of group, the reaction that you have to that. I'm
Yeah.
interested in that.
What, in terms of my own personal, like,
Or
any of us? Well, again, it goes back to you have to be on controlled processing. You have to avoid the automatic processing. To the extent that you can see people as whole people, even if it's a room full of, an auditorium of 200 people, the eye contact is really important. Speaking to people in a way that's respectful, sees their humanity. Still being authentic, that's a really big piece of it, yeah.
about, I'd like you thinking about how to be aware of impact, not just what you intend.
Yes.
But there seems to be a line there, and what triggered it for me was the blogger who saw the young people
Sure.
as having a sexy smirk. I mean, I think that guy should be arrested. Something.
Well, freedom of speech, yeah.
But the thing is that she certainly was not intending that. She had that impact on him. What is her responsibility? I mean, there are a lot of people that say, well, you shouldn't be wearing that type of T-shirt or something,
Right.
you know, and putting it back on her, and she's having this impact.
Right.
So there's
Right.
that line between when you're responsible for your
Right.
impact, but you're not taking on the guilt for
Absolutely.
for
Yeah, yeah.
something else.
And that's a complicated direction, and I think it's a space that folks need to, I think it's worth having those conversations in-house, right? What are the standards and what are the lines? So for example, I had a conversation recently with a unit where they have a lot of new hires, significant generational gaps. And the new hires have tattoos, they have piercings, their hair is different colors, and then the older generation is like, you're making the rest of us look unprofessional, nobody's gonna take our unit seriously. Well, is there a dress code? Well, no, there wasn't a dress code. Well, how are we supposed to have those so that's the kind of stuff, and then where do you draw the line? If it's hair color, is it on natural hair color? Well, what if I just wanna go blonde and I'm gray? Or, you know what I'm saying? Or if it's body modifications, all right, well, what if I get a nose job? What if I get breast implants? Now that's a violation of dress code? So there's all of these, you have to think about, it's a very slippery slope. How do you decide how you want to represent yourselves and be authentic and understand that there's going to be differences. What some person thinks is appropriate or inappropriate, I mean, that story is as old as time. And especially when you start bringing in generational and cultural differences. So I would say there's personal what I say to folks is understand there's a game, and if you choose not to play it, that's still a choice. So for women who decide not to wear makeup, that's a choice. But understand there's rewards and consequences to that. And so for some folks, they would rather be authentic. For other folks, they cannot afford to be authentic. I think it's an interesting conversation that I've had several times about the bounds that white men can push in terms of their physical appearance. How many tattoos is too many tattoos? Can you show up in sweatpants? Who gets to show up in jeans and a t-shirt? It's not a coincidence that Mark Zuckerberg shows up in a hoodie every day. Not everybody gets to show up to work in a hoodie. There's a particular type of person who can get away with that. And so thinking about how identity is related to that, you know, that for folks of color, they've got to show up on point. Hair's got to be done, shirt has to be tucked in, crisp, everything has to be very professional because people are already going to judge whether you deserve to be there and you're professional enough. So your clothing doesn't get to be an option. Even with tattoos, if you go to this young woman here, she's heavily tatted. Would she be invited into any space? Or is it only certain spaces? I will tell you, these are all real people. Obviously they're real people, but they all have real stories. They all have real stories. This woman is one of the most successful tattoo artists in New York City. She's 24 years old. That tells you she's not only an amazing artist, she has incredible business sense. You don't get to be one of the best tattoo artists in New York City at 24 years old without some brains. There's got to be some business savvy going on there. But would folks take her seriously? How would people respond to her showing up heavily tatted in sweats? You know, she would be underestimated. This gentleman here, he runs a charity organization in the UK. He's also Muslim. He's been stopped over 20 times in the last 2 years. None of his stories went viral because this is just the nature of being a Muslim man in the world today, until one of those times he got pulled off a plane on his way to his honeymoon with his wife. And the newspapers picked up the story. And that's how we know now that he's been stopped over 20 times in the last 2 years, and he runs a charity in the UK. So for folks, just by virtue of how they appear, we make different decisions about them. Yeah, go ahead.
In response to the question that was asked about how we deal with groups of people.
Sure, yeah.
There is a fine line between what might turn out to be functional and appropriate as opposed to discriminatory.
Right.
So if I have a group of older adults, for example, experience has told me that sometimes the hearing is not as good as a group of university students.
Sure.
What? So what I have found is I cannot afford not to ask. Please raise your hand if you can hear me.
Sure. Yep.
And some people might be offended by this, but I have found that to ignore that fact means that some people are just left out and I'm talking and they can't hear me.
Sure, yeah. That is one option, and I appreciate you saying that, where you're trying to be inclusive, and you don't want to assume even if the young folks in the room can hear you. There might be somebody else who has auditory issues. But you also have to be careful about not disclosing someone's identity. So for example, when we host events, we tell folks where are the nearest gender-neutral bathrooms, instead of asking, does anyone need to know where the nearest gender-neutral bathroom is, right? So just assume that there's somebody in that room, and maybe that information is not needed for anyone, but maybe it is. And so having those kinds of things kind of on the front end, when you're thinking about like how you introduce yourself to a group, what is the pitch that you give to every group that comes in, how can you make that as inclusive as possible? And so one of them can be, if you have difficulty hearing, please raise your hand.
But they can't hear me, so they won't.
Right. Right? So maybe that's something that goes on the screen, right? Maybe that goes on the screen instead. Or maybe if there's equipment that people can pick up on the way into the room to help them hear better. Lots of different options that way. Yeah?
This may be too broad and general, but how do you avoid the damned if you do, damned if you don't, and the cortisol always wham here because you're just not sure what to do?
Sure, yeah. So that happens, particularly with folks who are new to it. Like they start learning stuff and now they're afraid to do anything wrong because they don't want to have that, right? And so what we try to really encourage people to do is be your best self. If you're well-intentioned, if you are genuinely interested in creating a relationship with someone, then you're gonna engage with them differently than you would if you just had assumptions to make about them, or if it was a superficial, like, nod, in that, like, yeah, I get it, you're not, whatever, or that you are part of whatever community. If you engage with them in a way that's genuine, right? So to talk to somebody, for example, about, so I use the example, and this works with this age crowd, it does not work with my students. How many of you remember the Saturday Night Live skit, Pat? Right? Yeah. That was decades ahead of its time. It's amazing to me how forward-thinking that was. For those that don't remember, Pat was a character on Saturday Night Live, was a recurring character. Pat is gender neutral. We don't know Pat's gender. Pat's gender identity is ambiguous. Pat's physical appearance is gender ambiguous. Pat's name is gender ambiguous. The way in which Pat dresses is gender ambiguous. And the joke was never about Pat. The joke was always about the discomfort of other people who didn't know Pat's gender. And so they would ask all the questions to try to figure out, like, who are you spending your time with? Did you go on a date this weekend? Like, all of these things to try to get at Pat's gender, because they felt in their mind somehow that was the anchor. That was going to be the key to help them understand what to expect from Pat in this encounter. And so what I tell folks is that if somebody wants you to know their gender identity, they will let you know. But otherwise, if it's an itch you just need to scratch, you need to sit with it. You need to sit with it. That's not for you. That's about you. That's not about that other person. The same thing happens around any other identities that are ambiguous. The brain is trying so hard to fill in those gaps that sometimes we ask questions that are not appropriate. They're not our business, or they come out in ways that are very clunky, like, what are you? And that's a phrase that people who are racially ambiguous, whose race is not immediately apparent. Oh, you look so, I've never seen anyone like you. What are you? Like they're an appliance or a piece of furniture or something. That's not, but if you're trying to have a conversation, this is a colleague, right? And like, you understand that you've got different backgrounds, and tell them a little bit about your family and hear more about them. Building a relationship is different than voyeurism. Does that make sense? Yeah. I want to come back to this person real quickly because she's fabulous. Does anybody recognize her? I thought somebody might recognize her. This is Dr. Margaret Adderin Pocock, MBE. She's a space scientist and honorary fellow research associate at UCL's Department of Physics and Astronomy. She's also one of the presenters on the BBC's Sky at Night program. I use her as an example, not just here, it just worked out. I was like, oh, this is cool, I actually like this one. But I use her actually all the time because, number one, there are very few women in her position, let alone black women in her position, as one of the most highly regarded folks in her field. But on top of that, she's dyslexic. And when she was growing up, she wanted to be an astronaut. When everybody asks, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be an astronaut. Oh, honey. Oh. Why don't you try nursing? And that's what she was told. Well, you're so nice. You're so warm with people. You're great with people. Why don't you try nursing? That'll be easier for you. And the person who advocated for her consistently again and again was her father, who said, if that's what you want to do, we will make that happen. We're going to work hard at this. We are going to persevere. We're going to persist. We are going to find folks who will champion you. And she got there. But this is the thing. It worked out really well for her. How many folks are on that same path who get diverted? Because there's nobody there who's saying, I believe in you. You can do this. I will support you in this endeavor, even when it gets hard. Because it gets hard, right? I was great at math, and then I hit calculus and was like, nope, I'm out, right? Everybody hits a wall. Everybody hits a wall at some point in their programs. And who are the people that are going to sit with them and support them and get them the additional resources, as opposed to saying, maybe you should try something else? Because there's really nobody like you in our field, and it's going to be really hard for you. So let's find something that's a little more accessible, where you belong. Right? I mean, you can think about all of the ways in which that happens, either intentionally or unintentionally, right? Like people just trying to be good, thinking they're doing her a favor. And she ultimately went on to be incredibly successful, and still very successful, at her work, because she did have someone, and obviously had the ability to do it. She didn't just end up there. She had the ability to do it. But she needed someone by her side when there were folks trying to dissuade her, right? Okay, we have just a few minutes left, so I want to move over real quickly. There is the Harvard Implicit Association Test if you're somebody who wants to know more about your own bias. These are free. They take about 10 minutes, and I think there's about 20 of them at this point. Everything from gender to race, obesity, disabilities, religion, lots of different options, sexuality. They've added one recently on political affiliation, which tells you that is the sign of the times. I have some research in here for you. I'm going to guess that you already know the STEM fields are not very accepting or welcoming of folks of color or women. But if you don't know that, I've encouraged two things. One is that Shannon and Jeff are going to talk to you about working together to make yourselves more knowledgeable about these things, get these resources out to you. But they're also in your handout, a few different references to studies that confirm this again and again. And what I want to move to just for the last minute here is microaggressions, because that's where these things come up the most frequently on a day-to-day basis. Implicit bias is most likely to seep in at the hiring process. If you're looking at somebody's career, the hiring process is where it comes in. If you have a whole stack of resumes, who do you bring in for interviews? They're already all qualified. Right? By the time you get to the interview stage, everybody there is qualified to be there. You've done that part. Now you're looking for best fit. And that becomes very subjective. And sometimes people can't even put their finger on it. I can't quite explain why I just feel more comfortable with that candidate. Maybe because they look just like you. And they don't realize it. They absolutely don't realize it. And so that's the issue with implicit bias that I want to attend to. Obviously, there's a lot more. But this last piece just on microaggressions. These are subtle, one-off comments, things that are said, things that may not even be said. So over 70% of language is communicated through nonverbal cues. Most of our communication is nonverbal. Have you ever been in a meeting where the person who's running it doesn't look at certain people? It's very awkward. They have no idea they're doing it. Or you're in a session like this, and we only have a couple more minutes for questions, and they go boom, 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 and they don't even realize they've only called on people who look a particular way. Teachers refuse to believe We refuse to believe that we do this. And so for those of you who have those big rooms that you're talking to, ask somebody to videotape you sometimes. Because that's when you realize, like, oh no, I really do that. So you don't recognize that you're doing, even if somebody's there observing you and they say, no, this is what happened, we're not inclined to believe them. But if you have the video, you can see, oh, I really am only calling on certain people over and over again. So those are the kinds of microaggressions. A few statements that we try to encourage folks to avoid. So referring to African Americans as articulate. So there are folks who are well-spoken. They're good communicators, wonderful orators. All of those work. Articulate is a coded word, though, and again, it goes back to context. So in U.S. history, there was a period of time where black folks were not allowed to be educated. So if they were well-spoken, that means they sounded white, right? And the phrase that was used was articulate. If I closed my eyes, you would sound white to me. That's the signal. And so this may not come up as often in your field. It comes up constantly on college campuses where we have students and faculty who say they've been described this way and that it's offensive. You mean to give somebody a compliment, but the choice of words ends up being a signal that you're not quite clued in on. Asking folks who are Asian where they're from. They told you they're from the United States, they were born in the United States, but where are you from? There's a great video on that. We don't have time to watch it, but I encourage you, like in the break, it's hilarious, that flips this, the where are you from? You just Google it, it'll come up. Similarly, somebody who's born in the United States, particularly folks who are Asian, their citizenship status is questioned all the time. Oh, where are you from? Chicago. Well, your English is so good. I'm from Chicago. We've covered this, right? But because we hold on to those narratives so tightly, if something contradicts it, we try to find some other rational explanation for it. Like we keep digging and digging, like there's got to be something that fits what I'm looking for. I already mentioned the asking folks who are mixed race, what are you? Also mispronouncing names. Right? So lots of folks have difficult names. It's fine to ask them to repeat it. It's fine to ask them to repeat it multiple times. It's fine to make a note for yourself how to pronounce it phonetically. If you're in a space like this, table tents and tags, really helpful because it's a signal of respect that you're going to put in the effort to learn how to say their name. With gender, we've already talked about men and women's behaviors being kind of critiqued differently. We've also talked about transgender identities, right? If that's an itch you're trying to scratch, that's not necessary information. That's your brain telling you need information you don't actually need. I thought my generation got rid of gay. We did not get rid of gay. It is back with a vengeance. So just as a reminder, as a PSA, weird, unusual, boring, gay is not the appropriate adjective for that. And also remember, microaggressions can happen within groups, not only across them. So women's worst critics are other women. Implicit bias against women is actually higher among women than it is among men. If you're talking about folks who have moved out of the neighborhood or they've moved out of their communities, now you think you're too good for us. Now you're not like us. Right? So again, it's their discomfort, but they're projecting it onto someone else in their community. We actually had this happen in one of our classes here on campus.
Oh, God.
But I want you to know this is not unique to our campus. That there was a female student who came in wearing a hijab, and the professor joked to her, I hope I don't have to worry about you having a bomb under there. Like with a, get it, right? No, not funny. So I use this for two reasons. One, humor is really tricky. What some people think is funny is not at all funny or appropriate to other folks. The other, though, is to draw your attention to the importance of power differentials. And that power comes in many forms. Sometimes it's about identity, sometimes it's about status. If there's a person in the room who's been targeted and marginalized by someone who's in a position of power, it is unlikely they're going to bring that to their attention. So the role of allies is really important. Whether that person is actually in the room or not, the role of allies to step up and hold each other accountable is critical. You've got to be there as well to say that's not okay, even if you were not the target. Or maybe, did I hear that right? Do you want to rephrase that? It doesn't have to be in attack mode, but let's revisit that is really important. And then also insisting on helping folks with disabilities. Absolutely fine to be invitational. Can I get you anything? Can I reach that for you? Would you like me to get the door? They have the option of saying no thank you, and then that's it. Right? They will let you know if they need more than that. The last thing that I'm going to finish with, The most empowering thing I've learned through all of this, 2 things. You are not your brain. Your brain can send you a suggestion. You do not have to listen to it. You are not your brain. The other, though, is that the brain is not static. It is constantly changing. So neuroplasticity is an entire field, right, of study around how the brain moves, that you can constantly learn new things. If you think about like having a 2-track in your brain, if you go back to it again and again, it's just like driving down a dirt road. Eventually that grass will stop growing there and it will widen. And if you use it frequently enough, your brain will realize the most efficient thing to do at this point is to pave that road and let's put in a 4-lane highway because we're clearly using this information all the time. That's what your brain does. And so the same thing happens with learning new things about other folks who are different, about reducing implicit bias. If you move to the controlled processing for a while, over time, that will become your new normal. Then it will become more automatic, and you'll be less likely to engage in it. We've got some final tips there for you on things to do to reduce your bias. Knowing yourself and your own triggers. So I'm going to go back to those public groups. If there's a particular type of student, if there's a particular school that's coming in that you know always sets you off, be aware of that. Get out ahead of that so that it doesn't hit the road like when they show up. What are the things you need to do to prepare yourself mentally to provide an inclusive space for them and eliminate or at least minimize the likelihood of your own bias creeping out in the process? And then look for chances to be an outsider. This is a room of mostly white folks, so I'm going to say, like, I encourage pretty much all of you to go to spaces where you are the visible minority. If you have never had that experience, it is critical to your understanding of other experiences. If you've never been in a space where you are the only person who looks like you, find an opportunity to do that. You want to make sure it's public, you want to make sure it's safe, but you want to go there. And what will happen on the front end, a lot of folks experience anxiety. They don't know what's going to happen, and they're afraid that something's going to go wrong or somebody is going to be mean to them. That anxiety is important. Embrace that. Sit with that for a minute. When you get there, one of 2 things is going to happen. You're either going to be welcomed warmly with open arms, or you're not. You're going to be looked at very suspiciously. People are going to be skeptical and mistrust you. Both of those are valuable experiences because there are folks in your community and certainly all over the country who live that way every day. Every day they leave their house, they have that experience. And so if you've never had that option, if you've never put yourself in that position, do it for an hour or a day. It's amazing. It is like a fast ticket to empathy. And then finally, encourage your colleagues to do this work with you. They're going to listen to you. You are credible. They respect you. They trust you. That's much more empowering than anything I can do. I can send these messages, but you are their people, right? So if they hear it from you that this matters and they're watching you model this, it will be much less uncomfortable for them. I really want to thank you for having me here today. Jeff and Shannon have been amazing, but also that you guys took the opportunity to take this seriously. 9 a.m., I understand there was a lot of fun had last night, and you still all showed up. So that says a lot about your desire to commit to this work, and I commend you on that path. So thank you.